Hello, folks. I will be moderating this next panel, The Hidden Opportunity for Corporate Asia, Decarbonizing the Global Supply Chain. My name is Steven Stepczynski. I lead energy coverage at Bloomberg News. Thank you, Ishka. Joining us to explore this hidden opportunity for corporate Asia is Helen Clarkson, the CEO of the Climate Group. Applause, please. Yes. Yay. Jose Ordonez, the Managing Director for APAC at the CDP. Peter Backer, the President and CEO of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And finally, last but not least, Bernard Tan, Country President for Singapore at CNR Moss and Chairman of Golden Philanthropies. Thank you all for joining me here on stage. Thank you for joining me here today, this wonderful Thursday in hot Singapore. It is nice and cool in here, though. So first off, this is a very important topic, right? The global supply chain is of course remarkably important to how we operate as an economy and as a society, and Asia is where it begins and ends and is potentially the most important piece of that supply chain, as many of us know. Now, in the interest of time, I just want to dive into a few questions and open one question up to the panelists here today. Now, my first opening question is, the decarbonization has become a central pillar of corporate sustainability. Where have we seen the most meaningful progress so far, and how can we build on that momentum to accelerate action? Helen, let's start with you.
Thank you. I was thinking about this, and I think it's interesting that the question's framed in terms of corporate sustainability, because I think actually where we're seeing progress is where we're moving beyond the idea of sort of sustainability out there as something on the edge and right into the heart of business. And I think that's what we're seeing through our campaign. So Climate Group, as well as running events like this, we run big global campaigns, RE100, EV100, Steel Zero. These are commitments where companies make a global commitment to those technologies to saying, right, we're going to get to 100% renewable electricity. And then, as well as making that commitment, and we work with CDP to check on progress, we then bring them together, particularly in specific markets, to drive the policy change that will allow them to unlock. So across Asia, we're working in different markets, understanding what are the exact policies you would need to change and sort of using those corporate voices. And so what you're doing is there is the companies that are making those commitments, and Asia's been the biggest growth market for, say, RE100 for the last few years. We've had 143 companies join that campaign since 2020, is actually looking at how that impacts their business. They might be getting pressure along their supply chains. They might be understanding policy pressures from, say, Europe through things like CBAM. So they're not just seeing it as a sort of, moral, nice to do thing. It's kind of about business survival. And that's what then takes them into the policy work, which leads to outcomes we're going to see later on today. And in case people are wondering what we keep mentioning the China GEC on here, it's a really big moment where aligning how China defines renewables and RE100 is really, really critical, because with that alignment, you then unlock progress in China. So it's about that coming together of business survival in that sense, but also that policy work is where we're seeing progress.
Thank you, Helen. Peter, let's jump to you. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I mean, obviously, Asia is leading the race in renewable energy. That's where you see a lot of progress. What I find most interesting coming to Asia again is this is not a compliance conversation, which it has kind of become in Europe because of CSRD and those type of trends. Here, it's really about competitiveness, about future-proofing the businesses. The other thing I've seen particularly this week is the conversation around climate risk resilience has really stepped up enormously. And there's hard data to prove that. Sumatra, I mean, no doubt you have more visibility. In the last 5 years, more than 50% days of rain, more than 100% rainfall in the last 5 years. So the impacts are now here. Businesses are experiencing it. And what was said in the opening plenary of Ecosperity on Tuesday, that stuck with me. We are Asians, we are pragmatic. And that's really what is driving the conversation here.
Thank you. And Jose, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for having me. But by the way, just as a bit of context, CDP pioneered environmental disclosure 25 years ago. So I'm going to be somewhat data heavy today. So forgive me for all the numbers that I'll be throwing your way. Two things. One is transparency. So when you look at the CDP disclosure numbers, almost 25 entities globally between corporates and subnationals disclosed through CDP, which is a 7% increase from the year before, represents around 67% of the market capitalization. More importantly, what we're seeing is that these companies are using their disclosure data to drive business outcomes. And I think this is really important. An example of that is when you look at the cohort of disclosures between 2016 and 2023, what we have seen is that these companies have managed to decrease their Scope 1 emissions by 2% on an annual basis. All of the while, well, the world was going in the opposite direction by 1%, at the same sort of time frame. Secondly, and importantly, you've touched on that as well, is climate commitments. So the same disclosure cohort, when we look at those, 4,000 companies have now reported climate targets. And while this is all great, the reality is that only 35% of those companies are making inroads and being on track to meet those targets. Furthermore, 10% of those companies are putting together tangible and integrated plans as it relates to strategy, delivery, and governance. A last point on the topic here, we launched, along with Oliver Wyman, at the time of the World Economic Forum in Davos this year, a study. So we looked at ambition itself. And the analysis showed that the front runners, so the 10% of companies that lead, are pulling 4 business levers really well. One of them is climate targets around the 1.5 degrees, transition plans. They're also making inroads and making more commitments around pricing carbon internally. Very, very important as well is the link between executive pay and environmental KPIs. And then lastly, and I'll talk to that a little bit later on, is engaging with supply chains a lot more. So, well, this is all good, and we all think, we're moving in the right direction. What we also want is to see more stronger policies that rewards Earth-positive decisions in order to create a level playing field. So, disclosure for the sake of disclosure, as those have mentioned before today, shouldn't be the case. It's not just a tick in the box. So the data that comes with the disclosure helps companies illuminate the future and measure progress, but also to drive progress.
Thank you for that. That's interesting. Those last 4 points were quite fascinating. Now, Bernard, let's go to you. What are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Stephen, and thank you everybody for attending this morning's session. Maybe a quick introduction. So I'm Bernard Tan. I'm the country president of Cinemas, which is a group of companies that operates across different lines of business and across Asia. I'm also the chairman of Golden Philanthropies. I was quite surprised to see that tag on there. It's a philanthropy that's actually just dedicated to actually getting us to net zero. So we actually do philanthropic funding of initiatives and ideas that are novel in order for us to prove concepts to get us to net zero. And lastly, I'm the chair of the Sustainability Committee of Asia Pulp and Paper. And it's that probably that role that I sit here before you, all of you, to talk a little bit about progress that's been made in terms of carbon removals. So let me first start by saying I really believe that we have made large progress, probably not as quickly as we would desire, and there are enabling characteristics that obviously will help us there. So let me just talk about the pulp and paper segment. It is a hard-to-abate sector. If any of you have ever been to a pulp plant before, the first thing you will see is huge boiler, which you heat to very high degrees, and a lot of that power is fueled by fossil fuels. Obviously, we also use quite a lot of chemicals in the process of developing pulp, and that also emits carbon. So being also involved in upstream, where you actually plant trees and then harvest them, you do have an effect on land use. And that also affects the carbon equation. So obviously we are frontline. We are absolutely frontline. What I'd like to say is probably 3 things will change the industry, but 2 is quite advanced. Maybe 1 needs to move a little bit faster. And so the first is really the rules or the accepted regulations and the rules accepted in the game. I like what Jose was saying, that we want a level playing field because that will drive the entire industry towards new standards. So obviously the first one is that we've all agreed in terms of forestry that the MPDE commitments are here to stay. So no peat, no deforestation, no exploitation. APP was one of the first companies in 2013 in Indonesia to take on that requirement, and I think it's been followed by all major conglomerates across Indonesia. Now, obviously there are more we can do. We've just signed up to SBTI, so we've made a commitment as well to get us to net zero. How we're actually going to do that is still a mystery to a lot of us, right? But we're going to make a commitment to try. I think Peter was just mentioning to me earlier on that when he was CEO of TNT, he made a commitment that he had no idea how he was going to get there. But I think the attempt is important. Now, this acceptance is obviously important for us to first get to the point that this is the new rules of the game. Let's drive the industry forward. APP is about, and we are in the process of developing a commitment from not doing harm, there's no deforestation, to actually doing good. And that is restoring carbon sinks. We are still thinking through how we will make that commitment, but that's not going to be a long time coming. And again, enabling that will be the carbon markets that will again provide finance for that to happen. So the first one is, I think a lot of us have changed the rules of the game. It's also aided by the fact that countries are making very, very aggressive NDCs. The 2 countries that we operate in, Indonesia and China, have both made very, very huge commitments, and both are dedicated hitting net zero in 2060. So the 2030 targets are there. Again, as corporate citizens, we will have to participate in that. And so this is one of the things that we're doing. So that's the first point. The second point is advancement in technology. The pulp and paper industry is one that's characterized with huge capital investment in building pulp mills. And like coal-fired power plants, these last for decades, maybe 50 to 70 years. I know a coal-fired power plant is probably depreciated maybe about 35 to 50 years, but for pulp, we can actually make this go a lot longer. But during that period, a lot of technical advancements have been made. Our newest plant in Oki in South Sumatra has been designed completely differently. It has the largest recovery boiler in the world. It runs now on 98% renewable energy, right? And the sooner we can transit the world towards newer technology, the better. And that leads to the last real enabler, and that's financing. Obviously, we've heard over this conference last few days on transition credits. If we can get early retirement, some of these older mills, that will help to solve the carbon problems. But even a simple thing like having the carbon markets operate in order to provide financing for rehabilitation of carbon sinks will be of use. I personally feel that at the end of the day, that the industry would benefit from some form of universal carbon pricing, either in taxes or in credits that are tradable around the world, that will actually put a price on the externality that we have on carbon. And I think those 3 probably show a fair reflection. New rules of the game, technological advancement, and carbon pricing and financing are the 3 big enablers that have helped us move, and we can do better.
But I just want to ask a follow-up. I find it, you're in a space that's the hard to abate space,
Yes.
right? It's fast, cement,
Airlines.
steel making. Yeah, I mean, and anything, there are a number of these,
Yeah.
and you were mentioning your facility, which is looking, 8% renewable energy.
Yes.
Where do you see by 2050? Can you get to 100%? And what do you need to get support from governments to help meet the ends meet there?
It is quite clear that the industry alone will not be able to get to where it needs to go. So obviously we will try as much as possible to employ renewables, and that can come from PV, it can come from biomass, it can come from hydrogen, and we're looking at all that. We're even looking at refuse-derived fuels, so RDFs. So we're trying all means in order to get Scope 1 down. But I think for Scope 2, Scope 3, Scope 2 requires the greening of the grid. Obviously, there are national plans in Indonesia and China for that to happen, but that is a different story. And obviously for Scope 3 for us, largely it's machinery and transportation. And again, if it's shipping, it's a hard-to-abate sector. Yeah. So there are, like I said earlier on, we don't have all the solutions, but I think in every of these challenges, we will have to take the steps using rules of the game, technology, as well as carbon financing.
Thank you. Now I'm just going to jump over to Helen. Climate Group has worked closely with corporations for years across its various programs. With a shifting global approach to climate change, what role do you see for corporations in spearheading decarbonization efforts across the board, and how does this provide a competitive edge?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So that point about the shifting approach to climate, I think what we're seeing at the moment is obviously it's political pressure, particularly, let's talk about the US, kind of on, let's step back from climate. Everyone's sort of this green hushing term, which I'm sure people have heard. But what's quite interesting is the degree to which corporates are actually doing something different. And certainly it's very different. And I think Peter will talk more about that because I know he sort of, I don't want to say ping pong, travels between Asia and the States, and you hear radically different things on either side of the world. What's really interesting, though, is what's the degree to which corporates are doing things differently, or are they just not talking about them in the same way? And we're seeing quite a lot of that, where you might see things written a bit differently, but actually behind the scenes, or they keep going with the work, because it's so clear, the science isn't changing. The world around us, if anything, is telling us that this is happening much more quickly. And businesses understand that if you look forward out to sort of 2030, even or 2050, we have to be doing things differently. And this is now about kind of survival of the business. What we would like to see is that continued, as I say, that engagement. The real kind of engine of change that we've seen is the corporate commitments. In order to drive that work they're doing themselves, but also then pressure on policymakers. And I think if that loop breaks and you just get companies looking only on themselves, we will slow down. And I think the way that we need to see that spearheading continue to happen is that engagement with policymakers. That doesn't necessarily need to be out in the open. And actually a lot of what we do through some of the networks we run is to kind of do some of that behind closed doors, understand what it is that will unlock, take that to policymakers. That can all continue. And again, I think that speaks to this shift of these issues moving into the heart of corporate strategy rather than being seen as a sort of funny add-on. I think what's disappointing is, some of the ways that in which sort of some companies, you look at something like DEI, which everyone was talking about a few years ago, this is right at the heart of our business, got chopped so quickly when things changed in the States. We haven't quite seen that on climate, and I think that is because it has been built more into that core, but we need to see more of that. And understanding it, from a resilience point of view, will actually drive that.
Thank you. Now, Jose, just quickly jumping to you. Asia is a major industrial hub, right? It's a critical part for the corporate supply chain. Now, with increasing scrutiny on supply chain emissions, we have CBAM, we have other things coming online. How can companies ensure transparency while also prioritizing the growth that's really necessary for them?
Yeah, it's a big topic, right, on supply chains. Big topic in Asia. Asia being sort of the heartbeat of global supply chains, and then the center of that is decarbonization. So the way we think about it is, on the one hand, sort of mandatory disclosure is here to stay and to increase, right? So you've got different jurisdictions, whether it's Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia, next year, the year after, Japan not far behind. I was in Korea last week talking to some of the buddies out there about the same topic. China, the EU, adding many, many thousands of companies to the topic as well. So we think that whilst that is the case, companies should really be ahead of regulation and starting to think about future-proofing their businesses, making them more resilient. The key word for us is transparency. So transparency, not just in terms of sort of disclosure, not just in terms of thinking about risk management, but really thinking about how do you eliminate possibilities within your company, innovation, growth, etc. Transparency should be able to give us an accurate picture of what progress looks like for your company. And then you can put plans in place to attain those goals. So we're not talking ethics, we're not talking about environmentalism, we're just talking about smart economics. Our data shows that companies are not just mitigating the risk, but they're also driving growth. And allow me to share some data with you today. The CDP disclosure numbers show that companies that disclose through climate and nature are able to identify roughly $16 trillion in opportunities. Conversely, companies that have already disclosed have been able to save around $13 billion in operational costs. So those figures are pretty compelling. Just in Asia Pacific, a study we did with HSBC revealed that that number could be around $9 billion. Staying within scope 3, the supply chain emissions, we think that those are typically 26% higher, or 26 times higher, I beg your pardon, than scopes 1 and 2 together. So companies that are not thinking about scope 3, they're missing out on indirect emissions. On the flip side of the data that I just shared, sort of the cost of inaction in Asia Pacific, could reveal some blind spots. Within supply chains in particular, we see $74 billion in costs, operational costs associated with inaction, which is 3.4 times higher than the $22 billion that one would need to offset those costs. So how can companies grow while ensuring sort of transparency? So we think about 3 different areas. Not too different to my first point, turn disclosure into a source of competitive advantage. So it isn't just regulators, but corporates, financial institutions and corporates, they're asking for disclosure data to drive business outcomes. And that could be in the form of access to sustainable finance, terms within procurement, when you talk to procurement teams, access to lending, for example. So that to us is very compelling. We're very much embedded in some of those conversations as we drive action through the data itself. The other one that I mentioned before, alluded to before, is engaging supply chains. So leading companies are cascading action through their supply chains. They're asking their suppliers to disclose and to act upon that. On the other side of the disclosure, typically those companies, typically SMEs, will find a business outcome associated with that disclosure. And the last one is really turning and thinking about high quality disclosure, right? The better, the more transparent an entity will disclose is a journey. It starts somewhere, you become better as you get at it. That data is put to good, very, very good use. So thinking about the data as it guides a company's possibilities around, where to adapt, how to adapt, and thinking about data once again as a strategic asset, if you will. So while all of this is positive and we applaud sort of the momentum that we see in the marketplace, we also want to make sure that companies continue doing what is right for everyone. Decarbonization of a supply chain starts with disclosure. And disclosure is just the first part, right? Risk management is one aspect of it, but once again, we should be thinking about the possibilities as it relates to sort of unlocking that data potential.
Thank you, Jose. Disclosure and transparency, important topics. Peter, quickly going to you. The WBCSD was built on bringing together a range of perspectives from across the corporate space in Asia. Just getting your thoughts here, are you seeing a change in the corporate approach to decarbonization in this region?
I would say yes and no, probably. Like what Helen said, the conversation here is very different from what it is in the USA or even in Europe. At some levels, though, it's the same as well, because every boardroom is concerned about tariffs, trade impacts, and how that will change their company foresights. What I see, and to your point, Jose, it's true that disclosure is the channel towards the capital markets. But what I see really happen now in China, or in Asia, China as well, but in Asia, is companies have gotten the message that before you can disclose, you need data to make better decisions, to drive better performance, which you will then disclose and get better recognition from capital markets. And I see massive developments to the point that where a few years ago Asia was following what the rest of the world was trying to do, Asia is now beginning to lead. And so let me give 2 or 3 examples. Obviously, China in a centrally organized economy leading in terms of solutions, whether it's EVs, batteries, we all know the story. Japan trying to really link the innovation agenda to decarbonization is now leading, worldwide leading in TCFD adoption, in avoided emission accounting. But what happened here this week, and that is fundamental, in Singapore, the Singapore Business Federation, which runs the carbon registry here, is the first carbon registry that has adopted PACT, which is a Scope 3 accounting, product carbon footprint accounting methodology and data exchange protocol as the norm in their carbon registry. This is complete technical mumbo jumbo, and I understand I'm blowing your minds, but if you want to decarbonize a supply chain, you need to have data of where the carbon is being emitted and originates. That cannot be done with greenhouse gas protocol estimates or averages. You need product level carbon footprint. WBCSD with hundreds of companies and organizations has created the methodology, which is nice, gives us a good feeling, means nothing until an authority, like in this case, Singapore Carbon Registry, says, this is the norm. This now will allow all Singapore and regional companies to use that as the data to make better decisions, to disclose, and really get decarbonization done.
Thank you for that. We're running short on time, but I have a closing question for everybody. Let's keep our answers very, very quick. As corporates, look forward to 2030 and beyond, how can they capitalize on the green growth movement and future-proof all areas of their operations? Just one quick thought from you.
Yeah, I think thinking, the new buzzwords out of Europe, kind of competitiveness, resilience, security, all of that will get you the climate goals. So I think whichever lens you need on it, but understand how the world is changing and building that right into the heart of the business strategy.
Quickly, for me, disclose more, disclose better. Out of the CDP scores globally, 1/3 of those are in Japan. To your comment before, they're doing it today. They're not just disclosing in climate, but they're disclosing in water, forestry. Asia leads the way in climate, and in water, Europe leads the way in forestry. So continue thinking about transparency and continue thinking about your journey towards what good looks like.
Thank you. Peter.
What I just said, better data makes better decisions, creates better performance, makes your disclosure look better, and that will drive the success of the company.
And Bernard.
So lastly, I always say this to the people who I deal with within the company. There are 2 big disruptions that will affect the lives of all of us over the next 20 years. The first is obviously the artificial intelligence revolution, and if we don't have that incorporated in our business, we'll be out of business. The second will be the climate revolution. The way that we do business today, the carbon intensification needs to go way, way, way down, and that means a complete change in the way that we actually do production. Unless we pay attention to that, we'll be out of business in 2 decades. Yeah.
Thank you. I think, overall we're hearing that, transparency, disclosure, all of that needs to be embraced in Asia. It's good to hear that there are some really bright spots, whether it's in Japan or China. That's good to hear from, as someone who's living in this region, as well as in Singapore as well, the progress that they've made. Thank you all for spending time with us today, and let's give everyone here on the panel another applause for their work.